Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Morning. Hi, so I'm Dan Katz from the University of Chicago. I'm going to have the pleasure of co-organizing next year's event, which I'll be happy to talk about a little bit later on this afternoon. But at this point, I actually just really am here to introduce our keynote for this morning. So we're going to have Tony Hay from Microsoft speaking to us. Tony's the Corporate Vice President of Microsoft Research Connections, which means that he's responsible for worldwide external research collaborations with Microsoft, which is kind of an interesting thing to really have one person that's responsible for. Tony's had an interesting career, including having been a dean at Southampton, previously working in physics. It was interesting, and when I was trying to look up a little bit of things about Tony, I was Googling Tony Hay and various keywords and trying to see what the number of hits were. And so Tony in physics was 1.8 million. Tony in eScience was 2.3 million. And Tony in Microsoft was 13 million. So it's an interesting progression that's happened there. So I think this is going to be a pretty interesting talk because of Tony's experience with the eScience program in the UK and with eScience in general. And I'm hoping that we get an interesting look back at where eScience has been and forward to where we might be going. So with that, Tony.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, well, it's great to be here. I survived the ice bar, and I'm here on time. So what I'd like to do is give you a slightly personal history about eScience, tell you a little bit about how it started in the UK, look also to what was happening elsewhere, and then go to where I think we are now, and I'll tell you some of the things that we've been doing in collaboration around eScience, before looking to the future and where we might be in 5 years' time, and what are the key trends that are happening there. So, eScience, the past, and for some reason, I remember when we started eScience, there was a decision to be made, do you put a hyphen or not? And for some reason, we decided to put one in. But I got so tired of doing it that when I came to Microsoft, I took it out. So that's why it's changed, on the way I use it anyway. So in the UK, so let's go back to the UK in 2000. I was dean at the time. And John Taylor used to be in charge of Hewlett-Packard Research Laboratories in Bristol, and then joined the government as the equivalent of the head of National Science Foundation, head of the Office of Science and Technology. And what he did was argue with the government and get some extra money for research. And it was for specifically extra money for doing something he called eScience. And this was his definition. eScience is about global collaboration in key areas of science and the next generation of infrastructure that will enable it. So it's a fairly general definition. And then I was appointed to actually run his core program, and Trefethen and I had to sort of actually define what was meant by eScience. But the one thing he did do was put some funding in. So we had eScience, but we also had the opportunity to go and create something interesting. So there were two phases. One was the first phase for 3 years was an extra £74 million. You can convert that to dollars and euros, around about 100 million, I guess, or more. And that was spread around all the research councils, so particle physics, astronomy, biology, environment, and so on. They got a slice of that 74 million, and then what was happened, the part that Anne Trefethen and myself were responsible for was the core program, which was for putting together an infrastructure which built all these different projects into a coherent program. And in addition, there was an extra 20 million, which was for industrial involvement. And in order for universities to get part of that 20 million, they had to bring a matching amount from industry. And surprisingly, that was we had over 80 companies collaborating by the end of it. So that was the first phase. The second phase was a similar sort of money, and we'll see what we did with it. So how do you explain what eScience is? In the end, the way that I found the best way to do it was to explain in terms of an example, and to give examples of what we thought was eScience, the sort of technologies you needed to do multidisciplinary, distributed, networked, data-intensive science. All those sort of adjectives, not necessarily all at once, applied. So this was a project called the Integrative Biology Project, led by David Gavigan at Oxford, and this is in the proposal. It had 7 universities, including the University of Auckland, in addition. And the idea was to have, in Oxford, they had developed with Dennis Noble a very detailed map of how heart cells interacted and electrical behavior of heart cells. And in Auckland, Peter Hunter's group had a model of a beating heart. And if you could put those two together into a coherent model, you could actually predict heart arrhythmias, heart attacks, and so on. And you could also go back down to the cellular level and understand what was wrong and maybe actually do something about it. So it was a very exciting project to try and bring these together. But of course, you needed these groups to be able to share data, collaborate, and do their own calculations, but put them together. So building a sort of virtual organization to do that. And the goal was always for eScience, you sometimes call it enhanced science, but the goal is to enable faster, better, or different research, things that you couldn't do without technology. So that seemed to me the best way to explain, and giving some examples of that. So that was one paradigm. We also had projects, of course, which did just computation, distributed computation with grid middleware, and there were things like the particle physics wanted the particle physics grid for Large Hadron Collider and so on. And though that was a large part of what the particle physicists did and other communities. But for me, the most interesting ones were not just the ones that just had computing. And I think that the actual model of distributed computing with grid middleware, I think, was a little too heavyweight for most people. So I think doing it via the cloud is a better way. So just to show a few little projects, just a slide on each, just to give you a feeling of the sort of projects that were put in place. Again, this is one DAME project. This had Rolls-Royce involved, and the idea was that you could have real-time monitoring of a jet engine in flight down to a maintenance center where you could access a repository with all the maintenance history of that particular engine and all the maintenance history of engines like it and all their history of faults, and you could actually go and see if there was going to be a problem. So when the flight landed in New York, you could do preventative maintenance. And that was the idea, and to do the exploration, computer science brought in rather sophisticated signal data explorer, case-based reasoning, and engine model, sophisticated technology to do the analysis to pick up the sort of signals. And it was, again, obviously a distributed sensor network involving a large number of elements. And it was very successful and went on and has now become part of Rolls-Royce's procedures. So that was one example of it, if you like, a technology transfer. This is I came from particle physics, as you heard, and particle physics has lots of data, but it's really rather boring data. It's two particles coming in, a large spray of particles coming out, and you have lots of those events. But they're all the same character. What convinced me that there were real challenges for computer science was something like the MyGrid project with Carol Goebel, where you have all sorts of different types of data, gene sequences, gene expression, protein structures, pathways, and you're trying to make sense of all that and understand some therapeutic benefit or some origin of disease. It's a really challenging field, and the data is much more diverse, much more heterogeneous. Biologists need to talk to biochemists, need to talk to geneticists. They may be in different buildings, different universities. It's really sort of eScience infrastructure to make that easier is what was needed. So that was an example, and you hear today still the My Experiment project, which came from this because Carol and Dave DeRoer and people were doing workflows and Taverna came from this project. And then with the Natural Environmental Research Council, that's what NERC stands for, they again had huge amounts of heterogeneous data, as you can see from here. You can see they had data from the sea, satellites, you had plane data, radar, computational simulations, and these all had to be kept and put together and used to do modeling of the climate or the weather or the ocean. And so there was the British Oceanographic Data Centre and the British Atmospheric Data Centre run by Brian Lawrence at the Rutherford Lab. And actually putting that together, it was clearly a major task, and this was an optional project from eScience, which then moved into the center core of NERC strategy, because it's core to their strategy. This is what they have to do. So that was, again, something that originated with eScience, but has now become mainstream. And no talk would be complete without mentioning the Comb-e-Chem Project, which was Jeremy Frey at Southampton, and again, putting together all sorts of different types of data. You had an X-ray lab, a crystallography, you had a structures database, you wanted to do simulation, a large amount of different elements. It wasn't just computation. And so this is, I think, for me, the essence of computer science, actually bringing something useful to the table, bringing a way to analyze data in new ways, connecting it in new ways, working with the chemists. So you only got this eScience money if you agreed to talk to a computer scientist or you agreed to talk to a scientist. And that was very interesting because for the first 6 months, they talk past each other because the scientists typically think that computer scientists write programs. Well, they're not very good necessarily at writing programs. And the computer scientists think, oh, I've got this great technology which will solve the problem of the scientist. But of course it doesn't, because they haven't quite understood the way the scientists work and what their problem is. And so actually it required, gluing them together with this money, known as bribery. It's very effective for universities, certainly, until there actually was an understanding of each other's strengths and what the problems were. And that was really one of the key benefits. So this project led to many other things, I heard Jeremy talk earlier this week about some of the things that are still resulting from the origins of this project. One of them that I liked was done by Liz Lyons, was the eBank project, where they had a vision for the whole of the research cycle. So you had experimentation, you had publications, peer-reviewed data, metadata, you had a digital library, you had data, metadata ontologies, and you had, in order to educate the next generation of of graduate students, where they didn't have to go from scratch and learn everything so painfully and slowly as their previous generation, you wanted to capture some of this and capture this whole life cycle here. So again, some of that has been realized. And the last project I've just mentioned was another one looking at biological workflows, high-throughput informatics. It was environmental monitoring and bioinformatics were its fields it was looking at. And I mentioned this one. It won a prize at supercomputing and various other awards. But it was interesting because this project didn't do a technology transfer, it led to startups. And so here is a successful startup company from Imperial College came out of this eScience project. This is the commercialization. And then the last one is a slightly different one. It was a citizen science project called climateprediction.net. Miles Allen at Oxford persuaded us to actually fund this. This was actually getting the citizens all to run a climate modeling calculation on their PC and getting the results in. So they were doing a simulation from 1950 to 2050, where you find, for example, if you had an accurate model, that much of the Netherlands, for example, would be underwater. But it was looking at a rather simplified model, and instead of looking at a supercomputer version where you do a very high resolution and you do enormous amounts of detail, this was doing a low resolution, but in 1950 we did not know all the inputs to that model, so people make guesses. Now the question is, when you guess some input in this region, does it affect the results very much? Well, what they did here was a huge ensemble experiment where each person, so you could do it, for example, in a class, in a school, each student could have a different starting parameter, and you could see which ones made a difference. Changing this by 10% didn't change the output by 10, but these ones really effectively mentioned it. Jeremy, I've just mentioned Comb-e-Chem, I'm sorry. All right. Yep. Oh. Just checking. Okay, so, I mean, this was, since September 2003, there was a huge appetite. Here they had 60,000 people in 130 countries running this, computer time, and this was an early result here. You see the spread of results, so that you normalize it with these phase 1, phase 2, and then you let it go. Most of the results give you a few degrees warming. Some of them give you rather little, and just a few of them give you a much greater warming. And this gives you some idea of uncertainty. So it's complementary to the supercomputer calculations where you do a very detailed model. And so this has evolved into doing other things. And one of the things we've been doing with it is coupling this global model with a regional model. For example, in the USA, I don't know if you know the state of Washington or the state of California, they have these nice mountains, the Sierras in California and the Cascades. Well, on this global model, they're not there, all right? It's only the Rockies that are there. But if you want accurate forecasting of the water table in California or Washington, you need to have a more accurate regional model. So coupling a global one to a regional model is what we've done, and we've launched this regional climate prediction.net, doing this on a much more detailed scale. So you may be able to tell, you know, California that the snowpack will diminish in the Sierras, and therefore the amount of water you have available for agriculture, for drinking, for whatever, in the summer will be much less. What are you going to do about it? All right. So, and there just recently was actually a meeting in California near San Francisco. What are they going to do when Silicon Valley is underwater in 50 years' time? Because it's all very low level. Okay, so those are some of the projects that we set up, and it was quite a spectrum, and some of them were successful. I've told you some of the most interesting ones. They were not all so interesting, I have to say. The other thing that was helpful was that in order to get buy-in from the community, we set up these centers of excellence, and this is a very inaccurate map of the British Isles showing where they were. And they were important because we did it in a slightly unconventional way. We didn't just do it as an open call. We went and, using a little-known mechanism, we went and actually asked specific individuals in these places if they would put bids in, and we then reviewed them and so on. So each of these centres was associated with an individual. So the Manchester Centre with Carol Goebel, Newcastle Centre with Paul Watson, and so on. And that was extremely important. And our national centre was in Edinburgh. We also recognized that we had a problem that you make all this nice software in experiments, and of course open source is what I always used to do. But actually, when the project ended and the postdoc or the grad student graduated, postdoc left, grad student graduated, the software, unless you got a critical mass, the software just died. You needed to have people who knew how to maintain it, evolve it, or get to a critical mass. And so we made an attempt to do that by setting up what we call the Open Middleware Infrastructure Institute, which was to look at what were the best, most used outputs of these projects. Could we make that by doing the sort of things that academics don't do, namely do a whole more rigorous testing, more software quality, documentation, specification, all this sort of stuff, to make it into a usable product. And that was an attempt to try and capture some of the outputs of the program. We also looked at computer science, and so the computer science community in the UK is a very vocal community and always feels that it doesn't get enough money. So we gave them some money here to actually look at some of the challenges of the ideas that you needed to have in place, which involved serious computer science to help scientists do eScience. And so there was a whole bunch of projects that we funded for them. And so in total then, the funding was 250 million for these programs. But in addition, just to give the whole picture, there was another stream of funding from the research councils for high-performance computing. There was a big supercomputer, but there were also university systems, and I don't have a number for what that was, but it must have been significant. So it was probably another 50 million here. So, and then there was research infrastructure, which was the national network, which is clearly a part of the infrastructure. You can't do it unless you have reasonable bandwidth. There was a content repositories that they set up, and we also managed a committee for the research support, which on a scale of a research and development project was much more applied, much more concrete than doing blue skies basic research. So JISC was the organization that funds that, and so SuperJanet was the academic network, and we also convinced them that they needed to do lambdas and these hybrid networks where you can do switching down these lambda networks was actually evolved from that. Again, borrowing from the best from the projects in the Netherlands and in the US and Canada, we evolved that. National data sets and publications, and then a number of other things from Research Support Committee. One was authentication and authorization, the middleware, so we put up a whole framework for UK academia, digital curation center, and a virtual research environment. So just looking at that, authentication and authorization around Shibboleth, using SAML tokens and so on, and the middleware service where you could get certificates and so on. There was a digital curation center, which was actually, if you're going to keep data, what you need to do to it, you need to have the metadata, and you can't possibly keep all the data, so you needed to work with different communities to understand their needs. And this is what I learned from working with the Economic and Social Data Services, who had been doing this for a long time in the arts and humanities, and also from the British Atmospheric Data Center with Brian Lawrence. So lots of interesting things. The issues here were the ones that you hear today: long-term preservation, political, social, the size, extracting the metadata, the data publishing. You have lots of databases. They're built with huge amounts of effort, but how are they supported? You know, are they supported by a research grant? For example, in genetics, there's around 1,000 worldwide. How are these? Are they guaranteed to exist, or will they go away, and so on? And do they count as a publication? What it says here, the UK research assessment exercise counts papers, it doesn't count databases. And, you know, tying it all together, annotation, provenance, exporting, publishing in read formats, and security. Again, we hear these same threads at this conference and other places today. And then the idea of a virtual research environment where you can collaborate with your friends, you can have a wiki, you can have a blog, you can actually have some areas which are private, you can also bring in information and connect to all sorts of different resources. So virtual research environments was the name they used in the UK. I also found a slide saying what we thought was the ingredients for a global e-infrastructure. This came from 2004, and I've just picked out, there's a whole bunch. You have to have a high network, you have to have a AAA authentication, authorization, auditing infrastructure. You need to worry about how you keep the software actually that people need, which is not commercially supported. How do you actually keep it current? And you need discovery services and tools. But these technologies and standards for data provenance, curation, and preservation, I think, is a key component. And open access to data and publication via interoperable repositories, which I still think are keen and relevant today. So you can go and read a review about it. An international panel reviewed it, and I was most relieved when I got their report. The panel has concluded the UK eScience programme is in a world-leading position along the path of building a UK foundation for the transformative enhancement of research and innovation. The UK has created a jewel, a pioneering vital activity of enormous strategic importance to the pursuit of scientific knowledge and the support of allied learning. That was their words. So I couldn't have written anything more eulogistic myself, but so I was pleased. Okay, so that was going on in the UK, and that was the one I know best. And I apologize for people I haven't mentioned, and there were lots of things going on elsewhere, but that's how, with my UK focus at the time, I saw it. But meanwhile, in the US, there were some significant things going on as well. And one of the things that I took a lot of inspiration from in the way we set up the UK program was a project which is no more, but it was a very well conceived and visionary project, and it was called NASA's Information Power Grid, which Bill Johnston and Dennis Gannon were responsible for setting up. And it was a vision for how it could revolutionize how NASA addresses large-scale engineering, because it has labs around the country which do various things, and then you want to build something complicated, you need to actually put it all together. So again, it was appealing to me because it wasn't just about supercomputing, it was also about data management services and scheduling and putting them all together, and it also talked about workflow frameworks. So it seemed to me to have some things that were absolutely relevant, and I also quite like this picture, which shows you the sort of things you do to build an airplane. You have wing models, airframe models, landing gear, humans, engines, and so on. And these are in different laboratories around the world. Putting them together, actually, and for example, Boeing building the 787 Dreamliner had extreme problems because theirs was, this is NASA's in the US, Boeing was doing it worldwide, and they had a lot of problems in doing it. So that was, to me, a good vision, and that's why, in addition to doing computational grid middleware, we looked at things like storage resource broker for managing data. The other project which has increasingly impressed me as actually being a real pathfinder was the project that Alex Saleh and colleagues put together called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So that was the first major automated survey of a quarter of the night sky. And they high-resolution photographs, high-resolution spectra, and they took a huge amount of data in a period which was over 10 years, 15 years, and they generated 2.5 terapixels of images, which actually corresponded to, when they'd done the processing and everything else, to 120 terabytes, which at that time, 100 terabytes was a lot of data. And in the catalogs, they had around 35 terabytes. And so this was the people involved, and it really was a pioneering experiment. At the same time, there was astronomers in the US were doing the Virtual Observatory, the NVO, and Jim Gray had, at that time, met Alex Saleh. You heard the story how they met at dinner the other night, and they were getting frustrated by the slow progress of agreement in these big, rather bureaucratic organizations where they have to agree everything in order to do anything. So Alex and Jim, according to my version of events, we can check with Alex whether it's true, one summer got so frustrated, they said, well, why don't we just put it up as a web service on a database and just go do it? So they got a couple of grad students at Johns Hopkins and Jim and Alex, and they just put Sky Server, and they made this web service. Web services were very new at that time, and they actually made the data available to everybody, so people could just download it. And they've had a large number of web hits. They had about 1 million distinct users, as opposed to astronomers worldwide, I don't know, something like 10,000. They produced serious scholarly work, refereed papers, but also lectures to high schools and stuff like this. And it's very appealing, and it's very important the public pay for it, that they should actually get some benefits from it. And it was an interesting paradigm in that the data was published. You got 300 million galaxies or something like that here. There's no way 10,000 astronomers can look at all of it before it's published. And so the data was out there, and you could have the general public, as we will see later, actually doing things with the data. So it was a really pioneering experiment, which is the precursor to a lot of the things that we're seeing in astronomy and also in other fields. And then in 2005, I just arrived at Microsoft Research, and Dan Fay was organizing an eScience workshop there, which was nothing to do with me. I was very pleased to see it. And this is the talk that Jim Gray and Alex gave. eScience, the revolution is starting. Okay, so that was Jim and Alex. And this is the fourth paradigm argument that experimental science is always going to be with us, and people will do experimental science. Theoretical science, we now know how to encapsulate a lot of this data in physical laws of nature, which you can explore mathematically. You can make predictions for experiment. You can go and do experiment. Historically, those two paradigms are the way we've pursued research for the last few hundred years. But since 1950s, when we had electronic computers, we were able to do a new type of science, which is not possible to do experiments. Things like galaxy formation, things like climate change, climate prediction. You can only do that with computational experiments. Now, the nature of proof and reproducibility is, of course, different, because my program is not the same as your program, although it embodies the same physics. Well, they're not identical, but they nonetheless have the same physics involved in them. So there's a different type of reproducibility involved here. And you have to teach graduate students how to program these computers. The supercomputers are very complicated. They have memory hierarchies, complicated architectures. You need to know numerical algorithms that work. You need to know about parallel programming languages, a large amount of education of a graduate student to be a computational scientist. What Jim was very insistent on was that we were now seeing, with the huge amounts of data — I haven't got a slide on the data deluge, you all know about the data deluge — that actually people need to know about other things, how to manipulate data, how to put them in databases, what a schema is, and so on. And that's a very different set of skills than programming a supercomputer. And so there's a different type of scientist. It doesn't mean to say that the other ones are irrelevant. The problems will usually involve all four, but there are a different set of skills involved. And for me, eScience, I would now define as a set of tools and technologies to support data federation and collaboration for data analysis, data mining, visualization, exploring, scholarly communication, and dissemination. It's the set of tools to enable us to do data-intensive science, computational science, putting it all together. So ultimately, I hope, eventually, the E in eScience will go away. It's just the way we do science. But at the moment, it's, I think, useful to actually emphasize that we need to use technologies and sophisticated tools from computer science to help analyze problems. So this is their other slide. You saw the emergence of, besides computational chemistry, there's also chemoinformatics. Besides computational biology, bioinformatics, we know all about those. How you manage a petabyte, how you organize it, how you reorganize it because you got it wrong, how you share it, tools for visualizing, all these sort of skills Jim thought were important and we needed to do work on. And this was also his vision, that you'll have the literature up here, you'll have the raw data, and then by combining them together, you'll be able to do new science and increase the scientific information velocity and increase scientific productivity. Because it does seem to me that we do a lot of reinventing the wheel. And it would be really good if we could actually solve some of the problems that are urgent for the world in a little more efficient a way than we do at the moment. And use the money for research more efficiently because we can do more research. So that was Jim and Alex. That was the paper they presented in 2005. And this was the other question, another slide from their talk. The scientists bring the data and questions. You have data mining algorithms, people to know about the system software, and the tools to do Q&A and visualization. So those are the sort of skills that computer scientists can help bring to the table, but the scientists are the ones with the questions. And Jim understood it was not so easy to collaborate with a different field, and so he gave some advice, and his advice is the following. A way to engage with the domain science. Communicate in terms of scenarios, and scenarios is in fact how you now do software engineering. Instead of requirements, you do scenarios. He believed you should work on a problem that gives a significant benefit. If you work on an aspect which only gives you an incremental benefit, then the scientist is not going to bother. But if you can give them 100 times benefit within a few weeks, within a few hours of doing it, takes a task that took a week down to hours, that changes the game. You can do different things. And again, don't try and solve all the problem. Just solving the 20% of it really will make life easier. Some of it is going to take decades to solve. Go and do prototypes. That's very important. Don't just design things in the abstract and go from a working system to another working system. So it's no use producing prototypes which are sort of fall over all the time, or very ambitious things, takes you 5 years to design. Actually, you need to go from something that does something useful to something that does a little bit more useful. and you've incorporated some more technology, and you make it sufficiently stable that people can do science with it. That's the trick, and it's not so easy for computer scientists to do that. So going from working to working, if you want to keep the interest of scientists, you have to have something to show, you have to have clear next steps, and you have to have a clear goal. And I particularly like his last bullet, avoid death by collaboration meetings, because I do think in Europe we do a lot of collaboration meetings. Coming to Europe, well, there was a whole raft of European projects, and I'm not going to mention anything except one, right, which was enabling grids for eScience. Fabrizio, my colleague, was the PI on that, and that was building an infrastructure for distributed computation across Europe. Personally, I think that was misguided. I think actually you can do a much better job with things like clouds, and actually I'm not sure that the interoperability of the grids, we have a grid structure in Europe which is slightly different from the grid structure in the US, slightly different from Japan, so did we really need them to be identical? All sorts of issues that, for me there, but nonetheless a lot of effort and energy was put into doing this, and this was just one of many European grid projects. But let's go on to the present before my talk ends. So we wrote up a book of essays on the fourth paradigm, and basically it was Earth and environment. It was an environmental scientist with a computer scientist looking ahead in their field in health and well-being, and also in infrastructure. And so they were intended to be essays. So my role in doing this, all I did was try and bully the authors. I did not want them to write a scientific paper that would not be readable by anybody else who wasn't an expert in their field. So this is meant to be a much more general thing that you can just read individual articles without having to be experts, but it gives you a vision as to where you want to go. That was the intent. And we also include something that I and Jim felt was very important, which was the fact that besides the data revolution that we're in, the data deluge, we're also in a scholarly publishing revolution. When I was Dean of Engineering, I was supposed to review the research output of my 200 faculty and 400 or 500 grad students and postdocs. And the university library could no longer afford to subscribe to all the journals they publish in. Each year you got a piece of paper saying, which journal would you like us to cancel, right? I wanted to start a new area of nanoengineering and have some journals. There was no way you could do that. So the whole system is broken. I don't know how to replace it, but what I do know is you need to do something about it. And so we are in a complicated phase in a revolution. It's always complicated, but I do believe open access to stuff that the public has paid for is a way forward. And so I personally am an advocate for open access. And you can... This is the first book ever published by Microsoft under a Creative Commons license. So you can download it for free, and you're very welcome to do so. But if you want a bound version, you either ask us very nicely, and we send you if we've got some, or you can get a print on demand, or you can get one for your Kindle for $1. Right. Where have we got to? So we are seeing now some very interesting signs of progress. So this is one that particularly excites me, and there's also one about autism. This is one about Alzheimer's. So why is it significant? So this is in an area where we're told it's very difficult because of privacy and medical records and all this sort of stuff and ethics. This is something where they've done something significant. So this is a consortium, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, ADNI, 2004, clinical trials by getting different centers to agree to share data. That's how they set it up. So 14 centers have agreed to do the experiments and put their data in a database that other centers can see. So they're looking for biomarkers for Alzheimer's. All right? So that's what they did, and it took them some time before the first center, tentatively put their data there, but then another one did, and then it accelerated. It suddenly became the norm that it was there within a week of being collected. The data was available, and that's really a huge change. Putting the data that they've just taken, within a week, it became the norm that you had to put it in the database, and so the whole community started doing that. And from that database, hundreds of scientists have made downloads. And the interesting thing, several dozen papers have been published using the data, and some of them were authored by researchers who were not directly funded by the project. And that's fine, so long as you give some credit to the people who took the data. So that's another issue. But that seems to me a hopeful sign, and there's something very similar for autism. So there's at least a couple of examples where you can do interesting things. So we're going to, want to keep some of this data. Why do we want to keep it? What's the value of the information? Well, this was another interesting activity done by the US Geological Survey. They were trying to actually come up with what's the value of information that they're keeping. And so here they were looking at Landsat data, which actually measures over the years. It's taken photographs of farmland. I think this is up in the South Dakota. And they've been looking, here's the farmland in 2002, 2005, 2008. And what happens is that the fields used to rotate from corn to soybean to corn to soybean. But because suddenly it became a policy that they gave you money if you made ethanol from corn, they stopped rotating from corn to soy, and that had some side effects, because in order to grow corn, you need much more nitrogen fertilizer than you do for soybean. And so as a result, what they found that the water wells in this region were getting poisoned. And so an economic cost for changing the rhythm of soy, corn, was that these water wells got poisoned, and you had to do remedial action to the water wells. And so this was an attempt to do a calculation to reconcile groundwater pollution hazards with the agricultural needs. They wanted to grow corn, and lowering mitigation and treatment costs to avoid human health damage of contaminated water. You could actually put some costs on that. So it shows you that this historical data can be useful, can be used. This was another example that I find educational. This is done by the Coastal Ocean Observation Lab, led by Professor Schofield at Rutgers. What they did was been collecting high-frequency radar data, can remotely measure ocean surface waves and currents. And historically, the US Coast Guard, if there was an accident at sea and people fell overboard, they looked at the chart currents and the wind directions, and they estimated where the persons might have drifted to. But what they found, because this data was there, they found they could use this data to do a much more accurate job of finding where the person who'd fallen overboard was likely to be. And so this was what I would call a serendipitous use of data. It wasn't collected for that purpose, but it was used for a very useful purpose here. But I particularly like this quote at the end, and so this is something I like to show NSF. However, a large fraction of the data that the Rutgers team collects has to be thrown away because there is no room to store it and no support within existing research projects to better curate and manage the data. I can get funding to put equipment into the ocean, but not to analyze that data on the back end. And so that's what we've got to change, and actually make people recognize that there's a cost to keeping some of this data. And if you've taken a lot of money to go get it, it really is worthwhile paying people for software to analyze it and visualize it. So I think there are hopeful signs. And I mentioned the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. We gave this group at Oxford a very small sum of money in the early days. They've got lots more now. It's called the Galaxy Zoo Project. But what it is, it allows the public to go and help the astronomers classify galaxies, whether they're spiral, elliptical, rotating to the left, to the right, and so on. You can teach people how to do the classifications. And so, again, it's amazing to me, but they had 150,000 individuals. They've got more than that now, 200,000 or 300,000. People actually want to do that, look at the images. And in fact, it's not just the images. Some of them have been looking at the spectra. So as a result, they've actually developed things called green pea galaxies, a particular type of galaxy which hadn't been specifically identified. So they've had some respectable scientific papers published in respectable scientific journals. And one of the most striking objects is this thing here, which is in this scheme, it's a very strange galaxy, as you can tell, and Alex Saleh is, I don't know if he's got Hubble space-time to go look at it, but I think that was the plan, to find out what's going on with this. It's called Hanny's Voorwerp, which is Dutch for object. Right. Jim talked about X-Info and bioinformatics, cheminformatics. Well, now you see there's Astro-Informatics. This was a position paper by George Jaworski, who's in the audience, and others in September 2009, where they introduced the term Astro-Informatics, naturally related specialties including data organization, data description, astronomical classification taxonomies, astronomical concept ontologies, data mining, machine learning, visualization, and astrostatistics. It's this fourth paradigm set of skills which you don't normally have. But of course, they now have to integrate this as a formal discipline. You need to fund it. You need to actually have the recognition that the funders, that this is a valid part of astronomy, and they argued that the future of astronomy depends on this. And this year, here is our very own Dan Fay talking in Sorrento at the Astro-Informatics 2011, and the Astro-Informatics 2012 will actually be at Microsoft Research in Washington State. So those of you who are interested, I suggest you come. And we've heard Graham Earl at this conference talk about what I would call Archaeo-Informatics. That's actually archaeology. I've heard other papers on Archaeo-Informatics. So besides the traditional fields, you're seeing the informatics invading other fields. And so this is about his project in the Porter's project, the Port of Rome, doing excavations and models and so on. And you can talk to Graham about that. So what have we been doing? I thought I'd just give a few examples of what we've been doing. As I said, when I came to Microsoft, I argued with Jim Gray for 5 years, and I felt I'd lost every argument. But he'd called his, as you saw, you know, eScience, the revolution starts now. He called his research group the eScience Research Group. And so this is, when Jim was lost at sea, it was very important to me that we retained of our 800 computer scientists, at least a handful to do multidisciplinary work. You also have to actually show you're valuable to Microsoft by doing tech transfers and things like that. So David here, David Heckerman, is now the leader of that group. He agreed to take over after Jim Gray. And he used to lead the machine learning activity at Microsoft Research. He invented, for example, the first spam filter. So he does useful things for the product groups, but he also has an MD and actually wants to do some good using computer science, solving some problems. So this is his group. It's split between Los Angeles. So part of the deal was he'd take it on if he didn't have to go to San Francisco, where Jim had been, but could move it to Los Angeles. And so we have Los Angeles, and in Redmond, where I work, is here. And so half the group's here. Curtis Wong is a visualization expert, and I'll come back to him later on. So these are the sort of things they've been doing, and so this is what, if you like, the present. This is what Microsoft Research has been doing for eScience. They've been actually trying to use machine learning techniques to do genetic and environmental cause of diseases. So we've been looking at a few little unimportant diseases like diabetes and asthma, and found some interesting results on that in those areas using this data mining technology. We're also hopeful that we've made some progress in developing a vaccine for AIDS. We're actually doing trials in mice of our designed vaccine, and we hope it'll be effective, and we hope to try and use it in South Africa. And South Africa is very important because at the moment, 5,000 people a day die from AIDS in South Africa. And if you're a woman, by the time you're 21, you have a 30% chance of having AIDS. So really there is a need to do something. And in Brazil, with our colleagues in Brazil, we're hoping to be able to do a project looking at sugarcane. Brazil has been using ethanol in its cars for years. It's one of the places in the world that you can grow sugarcane. But of course, with global warming, the habitat may change, or maybe you want to grow crops and you want to put sugarcane in other areas. Can you make a strand which is more adaptable? Can you make it easier to get ethanol out, and so on? So understanding the genomic makeup of sugarcane is a major project because it's a gigantic gene. So that's another one of the things that we're doing. So that's what we've been doing about eScience, really applying some very smart computer science research technologies to solving some of these problems. And then you need to visualize it. And so this is what Curtis Wong has been doing, a worldwide telescope, not looking just at the Sloan data, but also the infrared, the ultraviolet, the gamma rays, the X-rays. Astronomers are very strange people. They don't classify whether they're biologists or chemists. They classify each other by wavelength. So the infrared astronomers use very different things than the visible or the ultraviolet. And so actually having access to all this data, being able to look at objects in different wavelengths, bringing all this data together so you can easily browse it is really good. And if you haven't seen Worldwide Telescope, I think I do recommend you go and have a look at someone like Roy Gould or someone talking about what you can do. You can get expert astronomers giving their tour, their personal tour of the universe, showing all the interesting things about star formation or dust or whatever. So it's a very interesting tool for education. What we're also trying to do with Alyssa Goodman and others is to see if it can also be a tool for research. And so she has this concept of seamless astronomy where Worldwide Telescope as a visualization tool plays a role. We've introduced this week a version of Worldwide Telescope technology that looks at the Earth. So it's not looking at the stars, it's looking at where we live. It's called Layerscape. It's a place where you can produce tours like this. This is just an example. What this plots are the seismic data. So these are just the seismic data from all over the world is stored in the IRIS database, which is actually held in Seattle, as it turns out. And so this is just plotting the seismic data. And what you see immediately on this map, you see the tectonic plates, just by plotting where these seismic events take place. And so, you know, Wegener spent years being laughed out of court, but if they could have had this, you could have seen immediately, here's the ring of fire up here, all right? And this is the ocean spreading in the middle of the Atlantic and so on. And since we're in Scandinavia, I thought I'd look at what it said about Scandinavia, and I think we're okay up here. Right? There's not too much going on here. But in the Mediterranean, you certainly have the potential for earthquakes. So really a new tool for looking at all sorts of data. And so the Japanese earthquake just happened. You can actually plot where it took place, the depth, and you can produce models of where the subduction zone, the one plate goes out under the other. So here's a model of the subduction zone in the Tohoku earthquake in Japan, and you can see the subduction slab slipping underneath the other plate. So interesting things to do, and actually visualizing all this data in new ways is not just an optional extra, it's really an exciting thing. So this is, I've talked about science, but really the Australian word e-research is probably a better word, because I do believe, as you saw in Archaeo-Informatics, a lot of these technologies will work in the humanities and social sciences too, bringing them together, making it possible. Social scientists used to analyze data on their machine. Now they have databases so big and distributed around the country that they have to bring it together and analyze it in a distributed form. So they have needs for these technologies. So this is an inherently multidisciplinary project led by Walter Alvarez at Berkeley. He's a professor of geology. His father was a particle physicist, won the Nobel Prize, and between them, they were the people who put the theory for the death of the dinosaurs with a meteorite hitting the Earth. And in order to prove that, you needed a whole set of multidisciplinary skills. It was found from the iridium layer you could prove that this event took place, and then eventually you could find out that this meteorite struck in the Gulf of Mexico. You can actually find the relic of it. So it's a very plausible event. But to do that, you needed to have a whole thing. And so what he wanted to do was have on a scale here that you could go from geological timescales to biological timescales to our timescales, which are much smaller, and compare these different events, the historical events, the cultural events, the geo events, all these things. How can you put them up to get a whole picture, holistic picture? So let's see if I can just do I don't usually do many demos because it's always unwise, but let's see what happens if I do this. Okay, so this is from their website. This is just a demo thing they did. So this shows here, you should look at the time scale. This is 13.7 billion years along here, all right? So this is the Big Bang down here, right? This is the first few minutes. And then there's all the other type dark energy for which the Nobel Prize is being awarded this week. Then metallicity, where the planets started forming and so on. And you'd like to put all this information in a way that you can actually examine it. So what this tool does, it uses what we call deep zoom technology. So you can actually go and look at the Big Bang. All right, so that's the Big Bang, so you can actually examine in detail what the particle physicists are saying is going on there. Or you can go back out to the cosmic history layer, and then you can look at the history of the Earth, when the Earth was formed. So you can actually zoom in on the beginning of production of continental crust, plate tectonics, impact history, and then this is the beginnings of life. This is the origins of these various forms of life, and it started, 4 billion years ago. Where are we? Well, actually, let's look at human prehistory on this scale. That's up here. Okay, so it's a very small part of this thing. Well, actually, even smaller is where human history is. So this is where we live. Okay, so we live just at this tiny little bit up here, right? That's a little paper thin on this huge concept. So actually being able to do this in other fields is what's known as the field of big history. What's our history going away? So it's certainly fun. Is it useful? I mean, I don't know. But certainly it's a tool we're experimenting with to see if I can get my talk back. Find my mouse. Here we are. Okay, so that's one of the tools we've been playing with in our experimentation. So what I think the community of us to do is to find ways of supporting the whole life cycle. And here's, just elaborated data acquisition, collaboration, data analysis, visualization. Then you want to disseminate through papers, blogs, wikis, and you want to archive and preserve some of it. We've been using this open source foundation, doing open source projects, a workflow project, chemistry add-in for Word. We heard this week about open source library. We have BioPerl, BioJava. This is bio.net, if you like. We weren't allowed to call it that because there's a company called bio.net. And then archiving and preservation. This is a project we did with the EU, the Planets project. There were national archives and national libraries were concerned that they had all these digital documents in their records, but they could no longer read WordPerfect. Anybody remember WordPerfect? All right. How can you read a WordPerfect file? Well, you have to convert it to a modern format. Now the modern formats, in XML-based formats, you can actually convert to OpenXML, which is Microsoft's version. It's an ISO standard, or the open document format, was standard promoted by Sun and IBM, or there's the Chinese version, which is UOF. It doesn't matter. Once it's in XML, you can use any tool you like to go play with it. It's yours. You can do anything you like. And so there's a conversion tool which converts between them, and this is a service to convert documents. Otherwise, you will find in 10 years' time you won't be able to read them and reproduce them. So it's important. What else is happening around the world? Well, we had a meeting yesterday looking at just this coordination. This is one of the slides that David showed. They have a very interesting e-research program, and that they avoided some of the mistakes that we made in the UK, and they put together a very interesting set of technologies. Just a little worried that they're not actually doing enough applications on top to use those technologies, but maybe I'm misunderstanding their program. And then we also have in your folder something about the Swedish eScience Center, which I think is also a very exciting event. So that's actually really good. It's a strategic area, and it's now going to be a part of the Swedish government's strategic areas. And we also saw in our folder the Netherlands eScience Center, which is an interesting initiative of SURF and NWO. So these are statements from the website, their mission. And lastly, I'm just showing a spectrum. Chinese Academy of Sciences has been doing an informatization program, which really has been involved to some extent around eScience, and some of our colleagues in the audience have been doing that, and so they've been looking at some of the same things I've been talking about. And there are other areas of the world clearly have also been looking at eScience in Latin America and Brazil and places like that. So many other projects, and that's where we are now. Where's the US? Well, this is now, the NSF are now trying to implement cyber infrastructure, which is US speak for eScience, in my view. And this is a slide that Alan Blatecki shows. It's calling, they had a report about cyber infrastructure. Now they want to implement it, and they call it CIF21 is their implementation plan, and it involves organizations, expertise, computation resources, software, networking, data, scientific instruments, as we're all familiar. And this is what Alan says. Alan Blatecki is the leader of the Office of Cyber Infrastructure in NSF. A goal of virtual proximity. You are one with your resources. Organizing fabric and foundation for science, engineering, and education. What are they doing? Well, they're doing similar things that we've talked about. A software development. They've recognized that software where there is no commercial place for, you need to make sure if it's really needed to do science, you need to try and do something about it. So they're actually looking at software elements, software integration, and software institutes here. And this is a solicitation from their website, Software Infrastructure for Sustained Innovation, the SI Squared program. That's just being advertised now. In the UK, incidentally, OMII has now migrated to a Software Sustainability Institute, same sort of idea as you're seeing in the NSF. I helped Dan Atkins. It was one of these stupid things, you know, I should have known better. NSF came to me and said, will you chair this task force? We really need one on data. And Dan Atkins has agreed to do it if you'll co-chair it. But of course, they went to Dan Atkins and said, Tony Hay has agreed to do it if you'll co-chair it. I should have known better. Anyway, we did it because I think it's very important. And these are the recommendations. Recognize data infrastructure and services as essential assets, so it isn't just an optional extra. New citation models, data stuff are credited with their contributions. Realistic cost models, because you can't do it just for nothing. How do you actually cost this? Who bears the cost? Is it the university? Is it NSF? Is it a mixture of two? And what are the best practices for data management? And they're just beginning this process, which in some places is more advanced than others. So I think that's an interesting thing. The data goals that they've put in for CIF21 are listed here: reliable access, innovative data analysis, technological innovation, data-intensive multidisciplinary science, and this is the data net is their efforts in this. There's one major data net project, and there's 3 or 4 others which are smaller, and they're partnerships trying to look into these sort of problems. Okay, well, I better finish, otherwise I'll get shot and you won't get your coffee. What's the future? Well, that's always difficult to say, but I'm going to pick 4 trends that I think are going to be in your future and my future, and they are the following. Open access to data and to publications, the cloud, more natural user interfaces, so you won't necessarily have a keyboard and a mouse, and I think some form of semantic computing. Whether it's the web and ontologies is another matter, but I think some form of semantic computing will be in your future. So just quickly go through this and then I'll stop because I'm outstaying my welcome. I talked when I was dean. I believe university research repositories will actually be a key player and will contain not only the full text version of your paper, doing exactly what the publisher says you're allowed to do, but also it'll contain the grey literature, workshop papers, technical reports, presentations like this and so on, and theses. But that's what they will be doing in the short term. In the long term, they'll also contain some data, some images, and some software, because my students never went into our university research library for library purposes. They went there to talk to their friends, to have a cup of coffee, a nice warm place to do Wi-Fi. That's the same as you can do in Starbucks. What's the purpose of a university research library for science and engineering? And I think that universities need to reevaluate that. And they can no longer afford all the journals, so what are they doing? They need to be the guardians of the intellectual output of the university, in my view. Okay. So I think there's money there which could be used better. Open access. The fact that you claim that you're an important university for research, you know, for example, in the UK, Oxford and Cambridge are clearly better than Southampton. But if you do a Google Scholar search, pains me to say that, but if you do that, a Google Scholar search of papers and citations, you will find that the most cited research publication university in the UK is Southampton. Why? That's because we have a repository with papers in that people can see, people can cite. And that's ridiculous. So I think it will become a part of the university's reputation management to have a repository that people can access, which shows off their research. And that, I think, will be important. And there's a coalition of open access repositories. Europe, I think, are ahead of other parts of the world, and they're trying to federate that open access repositories held by universities will be a way we will look after publications. And then you'll need to be able to cite people and also cite data. And these are two consortia that Microsoft Research, my team, has been engaging with. And there are steps along that road to identify a person uniquely. Is it Tony Hay, AJG Hay, Anthony Hay? You know, have they spelt it wrong? So, you know, if I look in Google Scholar for Tony Hay, I find the first few pages are relevant. Then I look lower down, I find they're mentioning Alder Hay Hospital in Liverpool. Well, that's actually not me, all right? So I think we can do better. We also have semantically enabled repository software, which we're looking at. This is something that's been used by the University of Bogota and also the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, putting in where you can actually do semantic queries on, in this case, for research grants, in the university's case, for their research papers, you can organize them and visualize them in different ways. So we are working on an academic research tool. I don't think we're there yet. It's actually a difficult problem, and we haven't got our act together, but we are trying to do it, and you're welcome to come and help us make something useful for you. That's what we'd like you to do. Historically, we've just been looking at computer science, but now we're trying to get data from all the domains, and we've currently got 37 million papers. We've got permissions to put another 100 or so million papers in there, which is what we need to do to have all your papers, but it takes time to do that. And so your help in making sure that it works would be much appreciated. There are various visualizations. This is my friend Andy Van Dam, who is connected to everybody in the field, and you can see that through his publications and things like that. You can also rank things on this, and so this is, it took me some time to get this. I had to choose the last 5 years, not everything. Last 5 years means Microsoft Research comes top in computer science papers. If you did other searches with different criteria, we wouldn't come top. And you can look at publications and citations. So, but you don't have to believe what we do, because we're going to give you an API. There is an API you can do, and you can build your own things. For Sweden, you may want to measure something different than you want to measure in the USA, or that you want to measure in France, for example. And so you can build your own tools. And this is an organization called eigenfactor.org, and they built some interesting things looking at not just citations, but sort of a page rank for papers. The cloud. So there are various options. We have internal IT. You can have a private cloud. We could, for example, put a container out in the car park here. It has 3 sockets in. It has power, cooling, and bandwidth. And then you have your cloud in your car park, a dedicated cloud, public cloud, all sorts of options. This is Microsoft's view of things. It used to be racks. Then you put them in these containers here. But actually, why do you put a building? If you make the container waterproof, you can build it without a building. So we've evolved along this line. Then you have to connect them all with high bandwidth, obviously. And then we have some projects looking at applications. So I think clouds will be part of your future. I also think natural user interfaces will be how you interact with computers. One of the things that's exciting for us, and we're doing lots of experiments with the community and also the general public, the maker community, if you like, is looking at how you can interact with gesture and voice. So you can pick up the skeletal tracking, you can wave to it, and it knows you're talking. And in addition, in a crowded room, what they did with Microsoft Research technology, you can be standing in a crowded room, lots of people talking, but it can pick out your voice because it's a very directional microphone. So it's a very clever device. And what will you do with it? Well, if you're a surgeon doing an operating theatre, you don't want to wash your hands, but you want to change what's on the screen, but you can use voice or you can use hands gestures to go do that. So I think there's lots of potentially exciting applications. And lastly, semantic computing. At the moment, we use computers for storing, managing, computing, and indexing large amounts of data. We index the web and so on. But what we need to do is have automatic computers being able to do this automatically: acquisition, aggregation, correlation, interpretation, discovery, organization, analysis, and inference. So in PubMed, 2 papers a minute are deposited. How can anybody keep up with 2 papers a minute in medical literature? So we need help, and the computers need to have the semantic information to help us. So here's, as far as I know, it's the one place that Microsoft, Yahoo, and Google have agreed on. It's a sort of vocabulary. It's called schema.org, and if I'm looking, for example, they know from what I'm looking at movies, and I type in Casablanca, it knows enough to say, well, this site is about Casablanca, the place. What he's looking for is a movie. It goes to Casablanca, the movie, because we put some micro formats in the web page using this vocabulary that the computers can read and understand what I was looking for. So that's the beginning. And so in the future, you'll have client, you'll have cloud, you'll have semantics. There's a movie in the States called Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. I think your future is cloudy with a chance of semantics. Thank you for listening. I apologize.
So even though we're running a couple of minutes late, if there are any questions, we could take 1 or 2.
David, what did I say wrong?
I'll tell you that later, Tony. No, it was a delightful talk, and you just touched on something which is fascinating me, and that is, what do you think the universities will look like as all of this unfolds? Because you made the comment about Starbucks, but a lot of us are thinking that there's more in that than.
Well, I think universities are. I mean, universities have a very long time constant for change. So especially universities like Harvard and Oxford, and they have history. That, as far as I can see in Oxford, where I come from, that there used to be people there whose job it was to prevent change, right? So they have all these committees, and you can't have dangerous precedents and all this sort of stuff. But I do think that this will overwhelm a lot of universities, and things will change. And so I heard a great talk by Hal Abelson the other week about how critical it is for universities for openness, and the fact that you needed to keep the lawyers out of universities. What he was going on in Texas now, when you give a lecture, as an academic, I used to give lectures, they're violating my copyright by taking notes of what I say. And so they make them sign a thing saying they'll, make sure they don't violate my copyright, but they're allowed to take notes. But if you missed the lecture and you wanted to ask, Ron, what did Tony say? You wouldn't be allowed to tell him. And this is absurd. So openness is absolutely essential. So there's all sorts of threats to universities, and open access and openness is a key thing. Competition, open courseware. Why should I go and listen to Tony Hay talking on this when I can go and hear, Carver Mead talk on this in open courseware? So I think universities are going to have to look to their laurels and deliver things. And there are a number of books just coming out about the future of universities, which I intend to read. But that's a very difficult thing to read. But I think it's important. People are now paying for their education, because I don't know how much they pay for each lecture, £100 a lecture. They want to get value for money. They end up with a huge debt. I don't believe that's the way we should do things, but that's another matter.